Hola, buenas tardes. My name is Marcela Garcia, and I'm an opinion columnist for the Boston Globe. Welcome to the Latino Media Summit, a conversation about Latino voters and the future of America. My guest here today does not need a big introduction. I have the feeling that most of our viewers know exactly who she is. Stephanie Valencia is the founder of Poderistas, but also co-founder of the research firm Equis Labs. She has extensive experience working at the intersection of politics, technology, and leadership development. The one thing I guess that you need to know about Stephanie today is that she and her team of researchers at Equis have worked in the last couple of years to expand and improve the way we think about Latino voters in this country. Welcome, Stephanie. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Marcela, and thank you everyone for having me.
So our goal here today is to have a forward-looking conversation that goes beyond the usual platitudes we hear about Latino voters. We're going to take a quick but rigorous look at the role of Latino voters, the role they played in the presidential election last year, and also we're going to go over some current efforts to mobilize Latinos that are shaping the future of the political landscape here in the United States. At the end, we're going to dedicate 15 minutes for your questions, so please put those in the Q&A section on the right side of your screen. So with that, let's get right into it. We all know by now that Latinos voted in large numbers and like never before last year. Roughly 16.5 million Latinos, that's 16.5 Latinos cast their ballots. That represents an increase of 31% over the 2016 presidential election. To put that figure in perspective, turnout increased 15% among voters of all races. This is a growing electorate, and we all know that. It is estimated that 1 million US-born Latinos will turn 18 each year through 2017. We also know that in some regions, many Latino voters shifted toward Trump, and that was a big surprise to many people. Again, at least compared to 2016, these are places like Arizona, Florida, and South Texas, but also in heavily Latino precincts in Massachusetts, Wisconsin, and New Jersey. So Stephanie, I kind of wanted to begin with the importance of words and how crucial it is the way we choose to talk about this complex set of voters, right? There's many different nationalities and identities. And in fact, the Latino identity is one that has multiple sub-identities, right? What do you think is the appropriate language we should be using now when we talk about Latinos? And why? Who are we really talking about when we say Latino voters?
Well, let me just start by saying that what I'm going to talk about today and kind of my basis of knowledge and understanding is based on close to 50,000 interviews that Equis Research and Equis Labs has done since March of 2019. We have spent a lot of the last several months really doing a post-mortem deep dive into what happened in 2020. And I think what was made really clear is that there were a lot of facile assumptions about Latino voters that were challenged. And to answer your question directly about the kind of language we should be using, I know there is a lot about Hispanic, Latino, Latinx. I think the fundamental takeaway about the label that we need to think about is thinking about it as voters, not as a voter, as a vote or a block, but as individual voters. Not because we need to be thought about as disparate parts, because we have more in common than we do not in common. Culturally, linguistically, even from an experiential perspective, we have more in common that weaves us together as Latinos from lots of different countries of origin, lots of different number of generations here in this country, whether we speak English or some mix at home. But we should really talk about Latino voters and as individuals we need to be thinking about, because what we saw this election cycle is so much diversity, especially ideological diversity within the Latino electorate, that we really need to understand them as voters and as different voting blocks within the electorate. And so as we do our work at Equis, we spend a lot of time thinking about different segments of the Latino electorate and what segments of Latino voters we need to be thinking about in different ways, the best ways to resonate and reach them based on separation by gender or age or state or ethnicity. And I think I don't have to say to this audience in particular the importance of understanding that nuance. And I think most of America, I think, woke up to smell the coffee this time around finally in 2020. Latinos are not a monolith. I think we need to kind of scratch that from the lexicon completely and understand that there's a lot of nuance to understand. And for those who really want to reach and engage in a serious way, the Latino electorate have to take the time to understand the data behind who Latino voters are, what they care about, where you reach them, where you find them, where they're consuming information. I know, hopefully, Marcela, we can talk a little bit about that, because the changing nature of news and how people are consuming news is going to be something that we are going to have to contend with regard to Latino voters.
Yeah, no, for sure. And in fact, I'm so happy to do away with the term monolith. I'm ready to never use it again. About last year, going back to last year, you and your team at Equis, like you said, have been poring over pre and post-election data, right? Surveys, focus groups, public polling, precisely to deconstruct that behavior. Tell us what you've learned so far. I mean, was this trend of Latino voters shifting toward Trump somewhat expected? Should we understand it as an anomaly, like a Trump-only phenomena, or as part of a broader trend?
Well, I think that is ultimately the question that only time will tell. I think there are indicators that we can take and understand that I'll get into here in a little bit. But I think what we learned was that while there was much reporting about what happened in South Texas and South Florida, those were obviously kind of very egregious examples of where we saw pretty profound movement. And there are a lot of hypotheses that we have looked into those places distinctly and more broadly about why we think there was movement. And I'll get into that in a little bit. But what is really important for us to kind of look at is that there was a fundamental and baseline shift of Latino voters in this country that happened outside of those places, in places like Lawrence, Massachusetts, and Passaic, New Jersey, arguably two places that were not necessarily ground zero for battleground states. So there was something that shifted. And I think the thing that we have to kind of take a step back, 2020 was an anomalous year to begin with. It was COVID. There were so many different factors that we will never be able to kind of compare apples and oranges with 2020 really ever again, because it was such an anomalous year. So I think we're going to have to understand, and again, only time will tell, where are things kind of a result of a snapshot in time and a result of a particular set of factors that kind of globbed on that only will happen in this moment in time, versus a longer term baseline shift and trend that Democrats, quite frankly, might need to be worried about. I think if there is one good silver lining that came out of this, was it really made both parties kind of wake up and see, look, Trump and I will give the Trump campaign credit for what it did, which is they invested probably the most amount in trying to reach and engage Latino voters using digital, social media, and other platforms than any other Republican presidential campaign, and maybe even really any other campaign generally since George W. Bush. And George W. Bush didn't have the bully pulpit of Twitter and social media and digital targeting at his disposal. So I think there are a lot of factors we have to unpack about why we saw this shift and whether it is long-term or whether it was kind of.
So tell us some examples of that, those notions that have changed in your understanding, what assumptions were challenged. Again, I think you said it perfectly that the examples in Florida, in Miami-Dade County, and in South Texas are very stark, clear. You have Cubans responding to a very clear message there. In South Texas, also, it was sort of like the economic argument. But what other trends you saw that, again, provide examples of how we should be thinking from now on, about Latino voters that we haven't, frankly?
So one is that Latino voters are not as ideologically hardened as some may think they are. People in the Democratic Party will often think that if they turn out a Latino voter, there's a high likelihood they're going to turn out a Democrat. And I think that challenge was that assumption was challenged this election cycle, and that there was a lot more work to actually do persuasion that the Republicans and Trump ultimately did with many of these voters, that challenge, again, whether or not there is a broader universe the Democrats need to be thinking about doing persuasion work with. The second is, as we've seen in our postmortem polling, one assumption is that those who are more conservative tend to be more assimilated. We actually saw the opposite. It was first and second generation immigrant voters who were the most likely to swing toward Trump. So I think that's another really interesting assumption that was challenged, which is it's not necessarily those who have been here 6, 7, 8 generations. It was actually those closer to the immigrant experience. And there are questions around, maybe being lower information voters, maybe being more vulnerable and susceptible to disinformation, misinformation as being a reason for that. The third was the gender gap. One of the things I talked a lot about over the course of the last 2 years was this kind of historic gender gap that existed between men and women. Mm-hmm. And ultimately that continued through the election, but there was a shift among younger Latinas that was interesting that we didn't expect toward the end of the election cycle. So there was something that happened in those last few months. Again, that was really interesting that a good number of women shifted and moved. And then the last thing I would just say that is very, very interesting, and especially to a room like this, folks who are in media and journalism, is those who are these new Trump swing voters are getting more and more of their news and information from YouTube as a primary source about politics and elections. So when something like January 6th happens, they're heading to YouTube, in part because we know that a higher proportion of us are on and get our information via mobile. And so they're going and they're looking at YouTube, and who knows what kind of videos they're seeing and the kind of news they might be receiving about what is happening. And so I think it's a whole question about how we think about communicating and reaching and engaging Latino voters, particularly as the news industry is in a very challenging time for survival, and how we continue to ensure that there's good news outlets, there are good news outlets and good information and good facts available to Latino voters about what's happening in politics and what's happening in the country.
So that's really key, and I kind of wanted to spend some time talking about the role of social media, right? So your postmortem analysis, and I kind of want to talk about this statistic. YouTube indeed has become a leading source of election news for Latinos. You found that 64% of registered Latino voters say they got election information from YouTube. And in Florida, it was higher at 74%. Mm-hmm. So how, and maybe, here we are, at this major Latino summit talking about the future of journalism in this country and beyond. And again, I can't help but wonder how that conversation intersects with the ecosystem of Spanish language disinformation and misinformation in YouTube, but also in Spanish language radio station, right? And so maybe this is a bit of a self-serving question, but what is the role that traditional or legacy media outlets play? Should we be on YouTube fighting for these audiences? How do we countermand this? These trends are very, very powerful, and that absolutely Republicans have completely weaponized and figure out that this is where they need this audience.
I 100% agree. I think traditional and legacy media organizations absolutely have to figure out, YouTube and social media and how to, and Facebook. Facebook continues to be a secondary source of really important information. Anybody can and the Facebook group, and that's both a good thing and kind of a scary thing, because anybody can become kind of a news source, or what appears to be a news source, right? And so one of the interesting things that we saw, and Marcela, you're right, South Florida has been kind of a microcosm of what I think the Republicans and conservatives have really tried to build in terms of a surround sound, year-round kind of echo chamber of their side of the story. And essentially what they have done is they've invested in YouTube influencers. People, if you don't know him, you should Google him. He was a former Clinton voter turned Trump supporter after 2016, Cuban American, probably in his early 30s. Very compelling, very fun, kind of a little bit of like part Sábado Gigante, part news, is like what his YouTube channel is like. And he had major Trump influencers and major Trump surrogates, visiting his channel pretty regularly. He was getting tens of thousands of views on every single video that he was doing. Meanwhile, we also see that conservative aligned forces have purchased Radio Caracol in South Florida for $350,000. Meanwhile, Democrats, on the other hand, spent $14 million in the last 30 days of the election on paid media. And so here you have, conservatives have, controlled many radio stations down in South Florida. And you also have Democrats who are kind of just, spending money on ads the last 2 weeks of the election, hoping that's going to motivate voters. And so you see like kind of the dissonance between these two approaches and what could easily be replicable in other parts of the country. So all that is to say that, what conservatives have done a very good job at is building these networks, whether it was on Facebook and the kind of connected networks that quite frankly made money by sharing information and reaching, voters that shared, news and information, again, with these different news outlets, to now bridging that to radio and being able to replicate that in other parts of the country potentially.
So do you see examples? I mean, has the Democratic Party gotten the message that, this is a playbook that, they could be replicating? Do you see examples anywhere else in the country? Because I do get that we spend an inordinate amount of time talking about Florida, when in reality, that's a very small percentage of the, Latino voters at large. But, I wonder if there are other examples in, elsewhere in the country.
Nevada, I think Nevada is again one of those places that feels to me has become very much a news desert. The Univision de Telemundo affiliate, as I've heard from people on the ground, is very bandwidth constrained. They don't have people working on the weekends. There's, very few people to do original reporting. The local Spanish language newspaper, which I remember working with back in is still struggling to stay afloat and stay in business. And you have Spanish language radio. And so, again, when you lose that connectivity, it becomes really hard to communicate with Latinos at scale. And certainly there are ways to reach them through digital ads or other targeting to try to reach it, but to reach them in a real kind of authentic, organic way, I think is one of the bigger challenges that we, the collective we, not just we Latinos, but we as a country are going to have to figure out. What are trusted news sources? How do we determine and continue to discern, like, what are the trusted news sources versus not? And how do we reach these, Latino voters? Many of these lower information voters are very susceptible to disinformation tactics and to getting, and we haven't even talked about WhatsApp and kind of how WhatsApp can play a role in spreading that kind of disinformation very virally in our community.
Have you seen research, or are you guys doing any research that kind of enlightens us or can illuminate tactics as to how to fight this misinformation or disinformation, or examples of people doing it elsewhere? I mean, I know some advocacy organizations, had these WhatsApp groups that were sending, teaching people how to sort of, spot misinformation and disinformation. Can you speak a little bit about that? What are some tactics, good tactics to do that?
So I think I would say, or the best antidote is, that all of to disinformation is good news and facts, right? And flooding the zone with good news and facts. So I think to the extent that you in this room and those who kind of think about these issues more broadly can find ways to reach and engage more people with good news and information, the better. That being said, I think that there are, a number of different things we're kind of looking at Equis. One, we're trying to understand, where are people getting their information on YouTube? Who are the influencers that they're following? Like, where are Latino audiences gravitating to on Facebook, so that we can better understand the kind of needs and desires and interests of those who might be most susceptible to disinformation. The WhatsApp example, I think, is a very good one. Also, I think, there are lots of different ways organizations or campaigns who do organizing year-round in communities can use WhatsApp as an organizing tool, both to disseminate information that people can share and spread in the groups that they are a part of. The soccer group, the family group, the church group, the friend group that you're all a part of on WhatsApp. There are ways for, say, an organization who's organizing workers in Nevada, say, has 150 people on a Facebook group. They are able to share content and information with those 150 people who can then spread that information with the other people who are in their networks. It's kind of like a snowflake model to how you organize and disseminate information. At the same time, you can use that network that you've built to feed back information on what they're seeing in their groups that may or may not be disinformation. If you ask anybody on the street, what kind of disinformation are you seeing on their phone? Nobody is necessarily going to think, well, what is disinformation? People don't know what disinformation is.
That's the whole point.
The problem.
That's the whole point of misinformation.
They don't identify it as disinformation. Right. They just see it as a meme that's funny, or a meme that, confirms a belief that they have. And I think part of one of the biggest challenges that I've seen about disinformation now kind of reached the 1-year mark around the anniversary of the uprisings around George Floyd is that we saw disinformation kind of being propagated in Latino communities through Facebook and other channels, seeding and trying to create wedges around race. During that point in time. And we similarly have seen with our colleagues who monitor disinformation in African-American communities, have seen information around immigration and anti-immigrant sentiment and that kind of content being propagated and spread in African-American communities. Again, trying to drive these wedges, confirming biases, and other feelings, negative feelings that that certain communities may have about each other. And so I think that is something we also have to contend with, which is a greater structural challenge and problem. It's a cultural problem. It's a problem that seeps back, centuries and years and goes back to colonialism in Latin America. But it is something we have to think about, is the way that racism and colorism in our community is used as a against other communities, and to create dissonance and difference and distance between our communities, and how disinformation is helping that to happen.
This is actually a key point that I was going to bring up. And before I continue, I wanted to remind our audience to put questions that you may have for Stephanie in the chat box for later. But to your point about race and racism, I feel like this is something that we don't talk about enough among us Latinos. And my colleague Jasmine Ulloa, actually at the Globe, just recently did a story about this, particularly in South Texas, and how this sort of tension between Latinos, artificial or not, or created or not, between around Black Lives Matter and and Latinos, and sort of this wedge issue between it's not new, divide and conquer, right? And pitting communities against each other. Do you see elsewhere in the country examples of Black Lives Matter, or just sort of alliances or solidarity efforts of advocacy working alongside Latinos and Blacks, and again across racial lines and ethnic lines, that could again provide us with a good playbook on how to talk about these issues, acknowledge them, but also fight them too?
So I would make 2 points here. I think the first is what I took away, things that I learned from last summer in the uprisings around George Floyd, is that there's a real opportunity for Latinos and African Americans to really kind of come together and unite around police brutality. In the same week that George Floyd, or within a week, 10 days of when George Floyd happened, there was another police shooting involving a Latino male in Northern California. What we saw happen with Adam Toledo in Chicago earlier this year. We have to really kind of find a way for us to see the connectivity of our struggle together, and that there is far more that we have in common and in shared struggle than we should be told we don't have. And so I think there's a lot of real opportunity with that. The thing I will say that I think is our challenge, even within our own community, other than the very structural challenges and traditional challenges we have about racism and colorism that exist in our community that we truly need to tackle, and we need media entities like Telemundo to tackle that with us too, because it is how it shows up in culture and in telenovelas and how news is reported. I remember last summer during all of the protests, we were seeing, the kind of coverage and just how it was being covered and on some of the Spanish language news outlets was reinforcing some of the racist kind of wedges that people were trying to create. And so there's a conversation we need to have amongst ourselves about racism and colorism that exists in our community. And the last point I would just make is that one of the challenges, and I think this is the big longer term 10-year, 20-year challenge for us, that as we think about, and as I think about how we understand Latino voters, not the Latino electorate, but Latino voters, is how we think about the question of a common political identity. And I don't know, we will never be able to have one common political identity, but what is it that is going to motivate and inspire and make our community feel like they have a common agenda, a common political kind of, and I mean political, not Democrat, Republican, but a political kind of cohesion and a political brand and a political label that unites us, and find power in that. And I think that the question of how Latinos relate to their identity and how that identity then relates to political participation is literally the $1 billion question for the next 10, 15, 20 years, as our is driving population and electoral growth. Marcela, you mentioned those numbers at the beginning around increased turnout and larger share of the electorate, which are all true. And we, along with AAPI voters, are driving the growth of the electorate. What I will say is, despite increased numbers and turnout in raw numbers, 50% of eligible Latino voters still sat out and are still on the sidelines. So there is so much work to be done. There was a lot of really important turnout that happened and increased turnout, but the greater our share of the pie gets, the more increase in participation we have to generate to keep up with our pace of growth in the electorate. So again, how we create that common and united political identity to increase turnout and participation is really the big question of the next decade.
Right. Going back to the question of Florida, right? Because again, I think that's just so much fertile ground there to cover, even though it represents a small part of who Latino voters are in this country. But this week, actually, there were some progressive advocacy groups that released a media monitoring report to better understand how misinformation gets spread on Spanish language radio, right? And, they basically said or analyzed media, like, again, Spanish, what was being said on Spanish language radio, right-wing radio, in the weeks, immediately leading up to January 6th, the insurrection and the aftermath, right? And then it's still ongoing in the, in Republican races there right now, the Senate race. And so this idea of reaching at the electorate constantly, year round, not just in elections, right? And media monitoring, again, I think it serves as an example of how Democrats can counteract this, disinformation dynamics, right? Do you think Democrats should be doing more media monitoring? Do you think they're doing enough? I mean, have they really woken up to how you fight this issue? Because it doesn't seem like they have.
Well, media monitoring is like this much a part of the problem, and understanding the scope of the challenge. Obviously, we will never know the amount of disinformation that exists. In fact, my team, Jacobo Licona on my team, information research work, and he monitors disinformation on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram, Telegram, to the extent we can, open WhatsApp groups. And now we're kind of shifting into monitoring television and radio. But what I will say is we could put 100 people on trying to monitor, and we would still never really understand everything that is coming. The thing I would also add to that is that not only is this in Florida, but in all parts of the country, because our folks are everywhere and they have connections back to all parts of Latin America and their countries of origin. We are fighting disinformation coming from an entire continent. It's not just disinformation that is being seeded and circulated here in the United States. We saw content coming in from Latin America that is reinforcing beliefs here in the US. We saw stuff coming from Colombia in particular. We saw a particular—
Such as what? Can you give examples of what kind of misinformation? Like, I assume that from Venezuela, but what about Colombia?
Well, a very particular instance was a Colombian congressman actually weighing in on a South Florida congressional election, that if we had a congressman weighing in directly on vote for this candidate or vote for that candidate in another country, it would be seen, would not be welcomed. It was not welcomed here. We've heard about potential kind of connected networks in places like Colombia that are similar to what we uncovered here after 2016, are disseminating and circulating disinformation in a coordinated fashion. That deserves more research and digging into, but we've certainly heard enough anecdotally about it that it is really interesting to think that there could be stuff coming in a very coordinated fashion from countries in Latin America influencing here in the United States. Again, we all know that people are connected via WhatsApp in their home countries, their families, their friends. And so information is just kind of flowing back and forth, going unchecked. And so I think that's one big challenge, is just this, and we can't monitor our way out of it. So again, the best antidote to disinformation is flooding networks and creating more networks with good news and facts. So I think ultimately that is where Democrats and others, anybody who cares about challenging or to focus on building those structures and the infrastructure to disseminate better content that helps to counter what people are seeing otherwise.
So this notion of Latino voters as the new swing voters, it doesn't seem like that has sunk in, right? Because when we talk about swing voters, we talk about swing voters in Pennsylvania as a completely different entity as swing voters in Wisconsin, right? Like they have different issues, right? And I feel like that's how we should be thinking about Latino voters, right? Swing voters in Florida, swing voters in South Texas, completely different, absolutely different, mobilized by different issues. The same with California, the same with Lawrence, Massachusetts, right? I mean, I still haven't figured that out. And I live here in Massachusetts. A very heavy evangelical, network of churches. Is it the radio? Is it? So it's all so very local and complicated, correct? But what I feel is that we, Democrats have really not understood that part of the Latino voters, that we need to start to be seen as the new swing voters, because we are persuadable, like you said. What would you say to Democrats right now? If you want to mobilize and galvanize these highly persuadable voters, does the strategy change? If you're talking about California versus Lawrence, Massachusetts, or New Jersey versus Wisconsin, should it matter?
So I would say I would give them 4 or 5 pieces of advice. The first is, you have to understand who you're talking to. And Marcela, I couldn't agree more wholeheartedly. Part of why you will never see from Equis, and if you go and look at all of our presentations, we never have kind of a national narrative about Latino voters. Everything we do is talking about what we're seeing state to state, and have many charts that compare what are happening in X state to Y state. But we never really talk about Latino voters as a block across the United States, because that's very kind of dangerous thinking. And I think oftentimes campaigns want like a one trick, one step, silver bullet. What can I do to talk to all Latinos? And quite frankly, and I've said this a lot, is Democrats have gotten away for a very long time in thinking about, in binary terms, about Latino voters. You're either Cuban or you're everybody else. And in Florida, it's either you're Cuban or Puerto Rican, when in reality, the plurality of the Latino electorate in Florida is not Cuban or Puerto Rican. And the largest share of the non-Cuban, non-Puerto Rican electorate is Mexican. It is not Venezuelan, despite what you might think, given the amount of attention to Venezuelan voters. So that is to say, understand who you are actually trying to reach and understand what moves them, what they care about. The second piece is not just understand who you're talking to, but understand where they are kind of on the scale and put in the work to reach and engage and persuade them. In our postmortem research, there is a graph looking at South Texas that is looking at a turnout score. And essentially what that means for those who have not worked on a campaign is you basically, every voter has like a turnout score. If you think you know, 100. And basically if you're above, say 75, there's a pretty big assumption that you will vote for the Democrat, right? And those are the people Democrats want to turn out. Well, Latinos, again, often get categorized in that bucket without much knowledge about who they are. And so then they get categorized in the bucket of get out the vote universe, and they then just talk to them the last 2 weeks of the campaign. And what we saw happen and what this chart kind of exemplifies is a side-by-side, and it shows that the people who we actually thought were turnout targets for Democrats in South Texas were actually Trump voters, or people that Trump had reached and engaged in the Trump campaign that had reached and engaged. And so that's the second point, is understand not just who you're talking to and what they care about, but really understand the universe of people and the kind of conversation you need to have with them. And that it's likely more of a persuasion conversation than just a turnout conversation. The third thing that I would say is really understand the issues. We know that immigration is always going to be a top issue for Latinos, but it cannot be the only issue that Democrats talk to Latinos about. We know from COVID and everything that has happened in the last year that Latinos were disproportionately affected in COVID, either as essential workers and immigrant workers who were impacted by economic shutdowns, or were worked through the pandemic under crazy circumstances and put their lives at risk. You also have, and Marcela, we lost your video. Hopefully you'll come back. Hopefully your internet's okay. So you have those who we want to make sure that they don't just treat us as we care about immigration, but you also had the fact that essential workers, you had the fact that people were disproportionately owners affected by the economic shutdown. And that is another really important thing we have to take into account. And so understand the bread and butter issues that really, really matter to Latino voters. And while I like to say immigration is a gateway issue or a differentiating issue for Latino voters, and Democrats can differentiate themselves with Latino voters on the issue of immigration, it is not the only issue they care about, and it can't be the only issue that Democrats talk to them about. And so I think those are 3 or 4 kind of big things and big advice that I would give to Democrats. And the last 2 things I'd just say are year-round organizing. And again, this like notion of how we reach people online and in a surround sound way, that is a person who is coming to your door and having a conversation, and that is in the community year round, and that a Latino voter feels connected to them. And there's also the kind of confirmation that they're hearing on radio and television and YouTube or whatever, that there's this kind of surround sound, for lack of a better kind of analogy, that they feel and see to actually feel engaged and touched by progressives or Democrats in a substantive way. So those would be kind of my 5 pieces of advice to them.
So lastly, I mean, Graciela is reminding me to, this is a good question that Graciela put in the chat. There's still a lot to work to be done, right, to energize Latinx voters. Because like you said, 16 million stayed home, right, in the last election, right? We need to talk about how to mobilize them. Can you mention examples or organizations, who's doing that well right now at the local level, mobilizing Latinx voters, but particularly young Latinx? And Julio Acosta mentioned Joel, Texas, working with mobilizing your Latinx voters. I don't know if you have other or additional examples to point out.
So one of the organizers and organizations that I've come to know in the last couple of years, I'll use two examples, one in North Carolina and one in Arizona. In North Carolina, there's a woman named Irene Golonias who runs an organization called Poder en Sí. And she did, she had some of the most creative, culturally competent voter engagement tools this cycle. One of them was she did a mailer of Walter Mercado that reminded people to vote. And so it was fun. It was a cute art piece. It was something that I would want to hang up on my refrigerator. And that's the kind of thing you want to be sending to a voter, something that they're going to hang up on the refrigerator and like remind themselves about a deadline or about when to vote. She ended up also doing a series of loteria cards and with Cal Cunningham, who ran for Senate in North Carolina, didn't have very high name ID with Latinos. This very culturally competent way that like made him kind of fun and exciting to Latinos who had no idea who he was. The second one is Lucha in Arizona, run by Tomas Robles and Alex Gomez. And, they have been organizing and coming out of SB 1070 in 2010. And I think one of the lessons learned about Arizona this cycle that, is a little bit of like where we might be headed in a place like Georgia or in the future with a place like North Carolina is, Arizona was not a fluke. It did not happen overnight. It did not even happen in the last 2 or 4 years. Arizona and what happened in Arizona in 2020 and, Democrats winning, Joe Biden winning it, Mark Kelly winning, was the result of 10 years of year-round investment and organizing in that community, led by Alex and Tomas and a number of other really amazing Latino community leaders in Arizona. And they have been organizing around state legislative issues in the state, pushing back on anti-immigrant legislation in the state legislature, but building a community-based organization that is not just coming to the community every 2 years and saying, vote for Democrats. They're building a collective identity and a collective sense of power around issues that matter in the community. And I think it is one of the most important examples looking back at 2020 at what worked very well and the kind of thing that needs to be replicated. Democrats will often talk a lot about, especially donors will talk a lot about efficiency and something called cost per vote, like how much money is it going to cost? But I think what we have to kind of come to realize is that there's, over what term of time are you looking at efficiency? Because, getting a Latino engaged in the process and becoming a regular voter actually takes a lot of time to build confidence in the process, to build, trust and in the process. And again, to kind of, you can't just say, come vote, and then you vote, and then they're going to start be turnout robots every 2 or 4 years. It really has to be a relationship that you are building with the voter. And so I think Alex and Tomas and what they've built with Lucha and across the Arizona Latino community is one that is a lesson we should take moving forward.
Yeah. So lastly, to wrap up this awesome conversation, I wanted to pose a question from the audience. This question has been posed by, and I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly, or her, Jehangir Katak asks, like radio stations in Florida, have any Latino media outlets been acquired by pro-Republican groups in Florida or any part of the country? There are also reports of PR companies buying local publications. Have you seen any such trends?
So what I know about South Florida is that beyond this recent acquisition of Radio Caracol is that the kind of people who have owned the more traditional Spanish language radio stations down there have owned them for a very long time and have kind of, they've been what they are for a very long time, especially, and they're owned by, Cuban American families who share kind of a particular view in South Florida. So I think that that is one piece that is, I haven't heard beyond kind of this Radio Caracol. I have heard of other people who are interested in trying to think about how do we reinvigorate some of these more local newspapers to give them life again, right? And that you're seeing more foundations, the Knight Foundation, other people kind of taking a more aggressive and forward-leaning role in how do we revive and rethink some of these local journalism questions. There's a lot happening again on Facebook, a lot of people being really creative, people like, this is not a Latino example, but one that I think is really interesting is somebody like a Jessica Yellen, who started News Not Noise, where, once a week she does a 15-20 minute explainer. Okay, this is what's happening in Israel, like in the Israel-Palestine conflict, like here is, like, in layman's terms, like, here's what you need to know, like that. And you're seeing a lot of kind of innovation and entrepreneurship, again, because anybody can create a YouTube channel. Anybody, you don't have to have, a bunch of money to go acquire a YouTube channel. You can just kind of start your own and start being a good messenger for good news and facts. And I think, for those of you who are freelancing, or for those of you who are kind of interested in creating a different platform for yourself, I would highly encourage you to think about that, either through Instagram or YouTube, and finding new ways to kind of get good information and flooding the zone, because this really will take a lot of people, a lot of different efforts across different groups of people to make sure that we are flooding the zone again with that kind of information.
That's a great note to end with. This, conversation happening, within the framework of the Latino Media Summit, and it's certainly a great entrepreneurial opportunity for people out there. One of my favorite TikTokers is this guy at the border, who is essentially an immigration advocate, but he does this, bit-sized pieces, TikToks of information, and it's all news, and it is amazing. And maybe if I was 20 years younger, that's where I would be trying to make money. But thank you so much, Stephanie, for your amazing insights and for being here with us, for your time.
Thank you very much, and thank you, everyone.